moto. Halo mo.
Iya.
Halo moto.
is a call to say that, we are going to wipe away what is not considered to be the dominant. You are from the margins, and if you have to be a player in the dominant hegemony, then you have to speak, behave, talk in a particular way. Now, having said this, these metamorphosis, the Pygmalion as a text, of course, talks about, metamorphosis or a change. That is something we will talk about. But just let us look slightly at what was happening at the turn of the 20th century. Since I'm talking about the new woman, the position of the new woman, and, let us understand that Liza Doolittle belongs to the poorest. She comes from a lower economic strata, and of course, it is her coming to an upper class or upper segment of the society is what this story is made about. Now, the concept of then fairy tale has changed. This is where perhaps, feminism also comes up. When you're looking at fairy tales, what is the basic line? That a woman in distress is somebody who will be rescued by a prince in power. So what is very, very interesting is that if you look at the many fairy tales, the Prince Charming character is constant. You probably cannot differentiate between the Prince Charming of Cinderella and Snow White. Quite similar. But you do have essentially individuals in terms of, let's say, a Snow White, Cinderella, and many others, Rapunzel, and all these, women characters who are being rescued. Liza, in that way, is not really looking for somebody to rescue. She makes that very, very brave decision to walk into the house of Higgins and says that she has come to learn the language so that she can be the assistant in the flower shop. And, she has taken the reins of change in her hands. She is willing to pay for her education. The kind of wish fulfillment, of course, comes through a character like Colonel Pickering, who Higgins says has lots of money and probably doesn't know what to do with it, will be able to support her. So Colonel Pickering becomes that, a person with money who seems to volunteer or wants to associate himself with a kind of a social agenda and a social purpose. So she's lucky enough to have that. But to begin with, it is not a Colonel Pickering that she has in mind and comes and walks up to Higgins. She literally tells him that this is going to be a deal, you teach me and I pay you. Of course, she doesn't understand, what kind of a payment or what kind of, money needs to be paid to Professor Higgins. That is different, but, she has taken the reins of the change in her hand. So this is where, she's perhaps more vibrant. So it is perhaps easier, for Liza, through a character like Liza, it is easier for Shaw to break, as and I would say, the circumstantial situations, of the fairy tale. So it is not, you might have wanted, Higgins and Liza to get married, but then when she walks out, and you can understand, Liza actually carries that very individual, independent trait of not depending on another. Freddie, whom she marries, cannot be an economic, supporter for her. And one of the, issues that would repeatedly come out in the Victorian novels and writings would be that ultimately when a marriage is taking place, it is some kind of an economic solvency that the marriage is providing, that you do not really marry beneath class. So therefore, if I'm looking at statistics around 1901, around 14% of the women would not be married. And so if I'm looking at the women, say at around, below the age of 45, they wouldn't be married, and some of them would, be in the margins, some of them would live with family members, and they would be, they would perhaps become accompaniment to older women. So that is how life would be. But the fact is that you couldn't marry beneath dignity. So this is also, one of the most resolving aspect, when you're looking at fulfillment for a woman character is marriage. So, Elizabeth decides that she would marry, and she marries Freddie, who belongs to a kind of a dwindling aristocracy, who just carries the baggage and the name of the family, literally good for nothing in that way if you're talking in terms of his ability to earn his livelihood. And you can see that Liza is fine with it. What is good about this relationship is that Freddie is going to hear what Liza has to say. It is a more equal relationship. Had she married Higgins, even if this could have been a sort of a fairy tale structure, it would mean she would continue to take instructions from Higgins, and that would not be a real emancipation. So that's a huge credit, and therefore, a text like Pygmalion, I think, pulsates the heart even today. That because this is, where, you have a woman taking absolute control of her situations, where there are bullies, like Higgins literally bullies her, tells her that you're a gutter snipe, and says that if you do not do what I tell you, I'm going to drag you by the tail across the room, and then literally bribes her like a child and says that you're going to give in chocolates, you're going to be given clothes, and then when she's brought in, he says burn her clothes and put her in the dustbin. The insensitivity, the insensitivity of the language that Higgins actually uses is indicative of somebody who is superior and is looking at somebody, who is slave-like, who is being transformed, and therefore, because the person is saying that you are a slave and you are being transformed, that I have taken this burden of transforming you is more than enough. So, I need not look beyond. And you have, interestingly, a character like Mrs. Pierce, who is a housewife, who in that way, is a kind of a class equal to Liza, who comes up and says that, I really want to know what terms the girl will have when she lives in the house. She sort of refuses to that insensitivity and calls to attention Colonel Pickering and says that, have you really heard something like that? To which Colonel Pickering says that he has not. So, you can see this kind of a collectiveness that, class struggle itself cannot succeed until unless there is a collectiveness, in it. Collectiveness across the people of the same class, and also people across the class. Across the class, sensitivity would be provided by Colonel Pickering and also by Mrs. Higgins, the mother of Professor Higgins, who would repetitively be apologetic to Liza and tell that she's sorry for the kind of behavior that her son actually indulges in. Okay, now if you're really talking in terms of, if you're really talking in terms of, the character of Higgins, maybe he doesn't have that kind of malice or intent or something of that sort. But, the confidence, the way he actually finally looks at things, is indicative. That is what I'm saying, is indicative of the attitude of a capitalistic society, of people of a certain higher liberated class who think that it is normal, it is how things are, and therefore Higgins doesn't find something abnormal in the way that he's talking and behaving. Okay, only with people with a socialistic agenda and an intent to change things actually seem apologetic and want Higgins to change their behavior. Primarily, of course, you have Colonel Pickering, and you of course have Mrs. Higgins in it. Now, if I'm looking at the Edwardian era, so what was really happening? By 1900, let's say, the suburbia had developed, which means that husbands were traveling to a certain job place, women were staying behind, so they wanted to fill that time, take up some work. So there were a lot of volunteering that they were taking up, especially in church jobs and related strategies. So with the possibility of volunteering, women found a new confidence. So they begin to mix with a wider spectrum of people, that they begin to take an interest in the political work. So there is involving larger money, they want to raise and campaign for some woman, as if these are not enough. So you are trying to separate them from political issues. So there were people who are more conscientious about political issues. So, and one thing that was also changing, the bicycle had come. So it was a freedom to move. So you could see Eliza famously, maybe she's not using the bicycle, but the fact is that she's able to travel alone. So you could see her take taxis, she's moving around the cities, and one of the, what will I say, props that, to sort of guile in that way, Liza, that Higgins uses, it says that you can take as many as taxi rides that you want. So, the freedom to travel alone, had also come. So, I am stressing on the word alone. It means that, you are actually recognizing her individuality, you are recognizing her individual self. So that is important. So if you're looking again, at certain other historical facts, Emily Davis, she came up with, the Girton College at Cambridge in 1869. This was, primarily to support women's education. So you have Francis Cobbe demanding that women could study for a university degree in 1862. So you have Josephine Butler and the repeal of the Contagious Disease Act that was so humiliating in its treating of women. One of the famous things about women would be that, she was, by her gender, more probable to be mad. She was somebody who could be mad just because she was of a particular gender. So all these campaigns, especially would work. The campaigning led by Elizabeth Anderson, who would become the first British licensed female doctor, and the setting up of the London School of Medicine for Women. So, these were the things that were changing. Slowly, the balls were rolling. So you are beginning to talk about, of an awareness, not only of, economic independence through inheritance, but you are also talking about women earning their livelihood. So you were just not being teachers, but you had across professions, that would be there. Florence Nightingale, of course, with her, position as a caregiver was also, opening up a different possibility for women in that way. Thousands were women, were being employed. So you have the sewing machine, which was like an opportunity. The invention of it meant that, they could actually work from home. So, few people would actually give women the position in business. So they wouldn't have really managerial positions in that way. But nonetheless, there would be number of women. So at least 25% of, the positions at different workplaces where, you could have operations being done by women. So, one of the most enlightening picture would be that, there would be this, middle class, all of them, employed with the telegraph department. So there would be male and the female members both who would be employed. So the all these things, was also changing the attitude of the towards the women and the way that you would see them work. Now, since I am talking about, women's employment, since I'm talking about the fact that there would be, you would expect them to perform and there would be competitions, not many would be very happy with, having women in the position of, these kind of positions. So they wouldn't be really very happy. So what would be important that, they would also have to become performers of a certain level. And that is what Pygmalion brings us. That is what Higgins says, that, I am going to, perhaps, make your tongue so good that, people will not recognize from where you come. And, Higgins is famous, for, locating people as they open their mouths to their dialect, to their pronunciation. He's able to locate them. And in London, he's perhaps even able to locate them across streets, a few streets. So that is there. So Bernard Shaw himself was a public figure, a social commentator, especially in the 1890s, and of course the time that you could see Pygmalion being written and published, a period, when public discourse was largely dominated by topics that generally, could be put under the umbrella of, social dilemmas, and of course dealing with the issue of the women question. So you have the iconic figure of Sarah Grant, who sort of, says that, it is important that we move from, journalistic, hypothetical writing to a kind of a more realistic or a periphery of realism. So the new movement, with its suffrage agitation, reformistic, etc., was also finding itself, as one would say, in a discourse of diplomacy. It did not mean that just because, you begin to have certain legal rights, certain political rights, that things had absolutely changed for you. This was not exactly what was happening. So that is, very, very problematic. So feminist writers, especially who are, locating themselves in this early part of the 20th century, say that the essential, rejecting, of the idea that the woman is a gender-based psychological human being is one of the major problems, because the female identity is rather socially constructed. So what is this idea of the Duchess? She's a replacement of the prince. If I'm looking at, again, if I go back to Cinderella, Snow White, Rapunzel and others, what are these women? This woman, are about, suffering, of being able to accommodate, the expectations of the patriarchy, and of course be submissive to the patriarchy. So, they fulfill that kind of a criteria. So even if they have the many temptations and the threatenment, they do not become evil, quote unquote. So there are always two types of women, women who are suffering and good and hence are rewarded, the other evil, who are essentially the witches and, the black magicians, etc., who because of their given characteristics are ultimately punished and of course alienated from the society. So they do not get, within the periphery of the society. So for Elizabeth, who seems to be, in her appearance as a non-qualifier for this role of this princess, so with the transformation that you bring about in her dress, or as she looks, as she talks, you qualify her for that patriarchal expectations. Okay, but this is where the text addresses that particular question, that, will Liza be happy by being or having become someone who is able to satisfy this patriarchal expectation? If she satisfies with it, it is a continuation of what was happening. There is no addressing then the question of the new woman. But Liza, by raising the question, what I am fit for, by throwing slippers at Higgins, by walking out on that night of success from the house of Higgins, when she doesn't know what she's literally going to do, probably she has no home in that way. She knows she cannot go back to that life of selling flowers, in that sense of, complete, mayhem in that way in her life. She is not willing to accept the dominance of Higgins. She is, not somebody who is believing, that, okay, let me, have and live, a life as Higgins would. Higgins would not have thrown her because of the, kind of a later acknowledgement that he has sort of grown accustomed to her fetching the slippers, keeping his appointments, If she continued to dabble and perform that kind of role, she would have lived, as Higgins says, as three happy bachelors, This is what Liza will not do, because it does not allow her to be a thinking individual. This is something that she refuses to be. And this is, once again, a credit to Shaw that he's able to bring up this, woman question, I wouldn't say it reverberates, but, the fact that, Liza throws the slippers at Higgins, it shocks the nuts out of Higgins. And you can understand why it does. It is just not Higgins, but, many of, I would say, the people across the hierarchical society, of the middle class, upper middle class, would react in that same way. So having addressed this, I come to the notion of the class struggle in that way. If you're talking about in terms of what will I say, the capitalistic and the working class in that way. So Pygmalion pictures, as one would say, the class conflict between the capitalistic versus the workers. It also, talks about the political economy practiced by the capitalistic who do not meet the needs and the aspirations of the working class. So what Shaw criticizes in this particular play is that, that even if you are sort of saying that you are creating opportunities for the working class, you continue in their exploitation because you believe that you are the one who is going to decide what is good for them and what they should do. So, they are the one who are deciding. So it is, your problems are being decided. So this definitely, apart from bringing us to the notion of the caste struggle, brings us to, another written industrial concept, of the material goods, that people could be fired, they could be underpaid, they could be starved, they could be living in slums, as we see Liza and many others. They could be neglected by the capitalists who take them as objects, and that is exactly Higgins's reaction against Liza. He takes her to be an object and says, I'm just going to change things with you, never ever talking about her as a human being. So when she's talking about her process of education, you will see Liza saying that had it not been for Colonel Pickering, she would not have known what it means to be an individual human being. So it is Colonel Pickering who addresses her as, Miss Doolittle, respects her, and comes up with those connotations of respect that is perhaps often taken to be the privilege and, exclusive to certain classes and not meant for the working classes. So this, of course, is primarily pointed out as a social revolutionary, as a Fabian. He was in a way in 1906, so was responsible for the coming up of this Labour Party. He argues that if you want to raise the standard of the working class, what is then important is mass education. And what does he mean by mass education? He's talking about lectures, he's talking about, operas, he's talking about plays. So therefore he knows the middle class has actually the opportunity to watch the play. They can actually, go and, perform and sorry, they can go and watch these plays. And since they are the ones who would be watching these plays, if you can bring about a change in the way that they are thinking, then of course you can bring about, of course, a change in the way that, they will look at the people. So if you look at Higgins, she objects, you would have one part of the play where you would see Liza objecting that Higgins can't take a girl up like that as if he were picking up a pebble on the beach. So she expresses, you could see, this is an expression of, of concern that Elizabeth's future and that, Mrs. Spears, this is what, Mrs. Spears says, and says that she has a right to know why she is here. And Mrs. Spears actually fights and says that Higgins cannot dehumanize Liza in that. Now, if I'm taking the Marxist ideology versus Shaw's ideology, the Marxist ideology was also randomly talking about the change in economic orientation, was talking about exploitation across wages, etc. Whereas Shaw was talking about, a social revolution where the emancipation is not only economical, political, but also in terms of, the orientation of the thinking man. How you think and approach is also a change that he's actually wanting about. Now, I am to use, Hobsbawm, yeah, and say that if you're talking about the play, what kind of, characters do I see? So one class would be that, who sort of have accepted what is their destiny, and they do not, uh, meddle and do not want to make a large change out of it, and therefore you have a character like Alfred Doolittle, who sort of is accepting. And Alfred Doolittle, in wanting to sort of, sell or, give up the rights of his daughter to, let's say, Higgins and Colonel Pickering for a £5, is not only indicative of a father-daughter relationship, but it is also indicative of the way perhaps leaders of the working or the labor class behave. The leaders often would give up, and talk about these people and their rights and behave as if, they have done good for them. So, Alfred's, unabashed, acknowledgement that, I should get something out of it, take my profit and move on, and then, it is up to you what you do. It is also bringing to question the role of the leaders, the social leaders, the labor movement leaders, who were probably not even concerned. So if I'm to look at Higgins and Colonel Pickering as the two hands of that system. Higgins, who believes, that these are the changes that can actually transform your life, and therefore it is. Whereas, Colonel Pickering and, in a way, Mrs. Higgins represent that sensibility where they are talking about, I would say they are talking about a certain change. They're talking about, acceptance of the human being as, a rational individual, and to, sort of augment their policies. And then if I'm talking about Mrs. Spears, if I'm talking about Liza, I'm talking about the class struggles, of talking about a collectivity, of, of wanting your rights, of being addressed, and being given, and being not exploited. So these are the issues then that are being brought up, Mike. So, these are types perhaps in terms of economy that I can look at. So, Shaw satirizes through Alfred Doolittle, let's say, the inability to protect human exploitation. That, you are unwilling, you are aware of it, and you seemingly, do it. On the other hand, Alfred Doolittle also is somebody who stands to expose the middle class hypocrisy, who in this, facade of, being very well behaved, of being kind, of having agendas, of talking about political, social rights, things to be, a kind of an intellectual things. But at the end of the day, they seem to have a kind of, loopholes and a lot of, I would say, emptiness within something that, Alfred Doolittle seemingly talks about. So economic elites like merchant, financiers, manufacturers dominated the policy making. So therefore, how much profit are you willing to share is also the question at the end of the text. So, by not actually thinking what is going to happen to these people with these policies, you are also talking about a capitalistic attitude who says that I do not want to share too many profit, and therefore, rules are so formulated for the working class that much do not go to them. But then when I'm talking about education, an important thing is happening. It is also an equalizer and is going to change the position of Liza. She says at the end of the play that she is also going to become a teacher of the phonetics. She's also taught, in the later part of the play, which is of course in the epilogue, that she's taught calligraphy, the art of beautiful handwriting. So that these commodities, these would be taken up, and this is something that she could sell, is also indicative that it is also going to change her position. So that is what education is supposed to make. It raises the question of education and the educator. Then what is the role of the educator? Is the educator somebody who will just educate you, give you those powers and leave you at the threshold and say, fine, whatever happens is happens, or empower you with the sensibility so that you can survive beyond? Unknowingly, Higgins, though he had never really thought about it in that way, ends up giving, Liza that power of, surviving on her own. the own method, which has also brought about a class change in Higgins. Higgins is somebody whose work, Mrs. Higgins might belong to the aristocrat class, but Higgins is somebody who earns his own money. He supposedly doesn't live, as one would say, through some kind of an inheritance. So it is with Pickering. So having come to a certain position through their own mechanisms of earning, these are new types of livelihood, these kind of livelihood, the possibility of a phonetic professor and his position in the society wouldn't be existing prior to the times that I'm talking about. Because, when you have these class changes, when you talk about, dynamics, and you quote, in that way, COAT, quote, people in a certain figure and say that this is middle class, this is higher class, this is lower class, and when people have to move through these classes, they also have to learn how to shape themselves across these classes. And these shapers, these motivators, this is what, Higgins is acting like, the motivator, he's somebody who's transforming, he's that educator who helps you to move through these classes and move up, okay? Though, he had initially taken, and he continues to take, Liza for a long time, as an object, somebody who doesn't seem to be having her own mind. And, she has to be told, okay, speak this way, talk this way, do this way, and therefore, she has her no, she doesn't have her own identity in that. Higgins talks about rubbing her identity to the extent thinking her that she's somebody like, it's more like a machine, who just has to be pinned and told, and she will behave in that way. So this expectation of the woman that she would behave according to the criterions that are laid by her is being objected by Liza, and that's the message of the text. That is how this, the woman question, the class struggle, also comes up. So through this, many, what will I say, attitudes that we see, Higgins, Pickering, realizing that, at the end, if you remember that particular scene where they when they come back and they sort of say they're happy that this whole thing is over, and do not congratulate Liza about it, as I say, is the typical capitalistic attitude, the capitalist who is unwilling to acknowledge the person who is worked, the worker, and the contribution of the worker towards a certain product which is never acknowledged. So, this attitude of Higgins towards, and Pickering to an extent, towards Liza is reminiscent of this, I never thought of us making another one yet, and you never think of anything else. I only want to be natural. So that is, Liza's answer. When Higgins asks, or that, what is she lacking, what is she complaining, they have transformed her life, that is what fairy tales are made of. We have given you opportunities that people don't actually have. We have given you what, fairy tales should be about, and then, being part of this fairy tale, you complain. And what at the end of a fairy tale is a princess, or the one transformed, supposed to do? Happy and live happily ever after. Why is it that Liza gets up and complains, what am I fit for? As if she does not see this end as a happy ending. So, this, aspiration, this question, also is a portrayal of the social conditions of the 19th century, saying that, it is, expressing that by talking about certain language, or by talking or behaving in a certain manner, or getting clothed in a certain manner, you cannot, claim that you have transformed a person. So it is, then, as I said, talking about voices. It is the power of expression. So if I again to look at fairy tales, do the heroines of the fairy tales speak? Hardly. That they suffer, that they behave in a particular manner, fulfill that aspirations of what is expected in that very Pygmalion sensibility. She is rewarded and she is to be happy. So her happiness is rather defined and quantified and told by others. Liza refuses to live by that. So the suggestion at the end of the play that she is supposed to marry Freddie, who will not be an economical supporter, and Liza looks forward to supporting her own family, being that independent economic person, having a say in running her own family is, I think, a fantastic movement ahead. It really, really brings the real woman, anticipates, as I would say, the later 20th century or the 21st century woman, who is able to write her own story. So Liza refuses that, Higgins and others have the, power to write the story for her, to write her life story, just because they claim that we have transformed him. So that is, I think, uh, not only the beauty of the text, but that is what, how it addresses the woman question. And that is, what Liza's questions, what am I fit for? Fit for fairy tales, fit for tales written by others, fit for, whatever you wish me to be, or fit for writing my own tale. I would rather support the third one and say she's left with the independent sensibility of being allowed to write her own story. Right? Thank you so much. So if you have any questions, thank you for hearing me and for your patience. So if you have questions, I'm willing to.
Yes, Madhumita, thank you so much for this wonderful lecture. Madhumita has tied up the text wonderfully with the socio-economic backdrop of that time, the Victorian society, social classes, class struggles, the growing movement for the emancipation of women, the rise of new women. I would like to request the students to type your questions in the chat box, and I would also like to request Shinjini, Dr. Shinjini Basu, the coordinator of the IQAC and also a very dear colleague of my department, to take up this last segment of this lecture, to coordinate the questions if the students have any, and to give the vote of thanks.
Thank you, Parvita Di. Okay, we already have a question. Onish asks, can we call Higgins a narcissist? And also, how much Shaw was influenced by Marxist philosophy? Madhudi, if you would like to take up.
Yes. And if you're talking in terms of narcissism, more than narcissism, yes, I think it is narcissism, but I am to see this narcissism not of the self, but Higgins's own idea of how class functions. He believes that, people are so obsessed with the way they look, the way they behave, or way they talk, and he thinks that these are only facades or outsiders that are used as a qualifier to move through the, classes. And that is what he sees in his own student Nepomuk. Nepomuk, who seems to have made a mark, of being an interpreter in this party. So, he has a disdain for this, and therefore, he just believes, people behave in this way, and these are things that can be given as a kind of an ornament, to people, and they are unable to be individual thinkers. They do not have any mind of their own. It is because of this, because of this particular belief, that he begins to treat Liza from the very beginning somebody who cannot have her mind. Because she, he believes that she is somebody to be made into a certain thing. She's to be given these ornaments, and Liza will stay with these ornaments and be empty and be non-thinking like many others that he has seen. This is one. As far as Marxist ideology is concerned, I would say Shaw is partially influenced by it, because he was into socialism. He was talking about the changing position of people in the society. He was talking in terms more of changes in terms of sociological approach, a cultural approach to the people. He was more interested in it. But at the end of the day, perhaps Shaw could not deny that this was also influenced by the economic resources that you have. So through a character like Alfred Doolittle, he probably satirizes that, Alfred, who is a free thinking person who seems to have his very bohemian, social, moral attitudes, he becomes, in the moment he gets recommended by a professor like Higgins, who has a social position and, ability to recommend others, Alfred Doolittle immediately runs into money and people begin to hear him. So Doolittle, in his approach to life, has probably not changed. He probably talks what he was talking as a dustman. But this economic as change is also what changes the course of his own life. Whereas the woman who is to live with him now insists on marrying. He suddenly seems to have relatives, and when Liza is not to be found, he again thinks like many others. She might be thinking that now I have a father who can look after me, and therefore she must be searching for him. He's quite sure about that, though he turns out to be very wrong. So these are there, but direct influence of Marx, I wouldn't say not that much. It's more a social, cultural change that Shaw is advocating through his Fabian Society.
Uh, Thank you, Madhumita ji. Does anybody have any other questions? If you have questions, please write it in the chat box. Right. So we come to the end of quite a scintillating lecture. As all of our students know that we have been, and as Dr. Haldar has already pointed out, we have been arranging, organizing, this, lectures as part of our special lecture, sort of literature lecture series, uh, in order to not just cover certain topics of our syllabus, but also to show linkages, see linkages, and if at all students can find certain see texts in their context, in their own culture, social and cultural context, and also in the context of other texts. Particularly for fifth semester students, this semester they have already done with us Mary Wollstonecraft. They have done with us Virginia Woolf's Zoom interview. They are also doing a bit of Marxist philosophy, because we are doing right now Antonio Gramsci. So I would like our students, beyond obviously, this was about Pygmalion and the text, its context, what Shaw wants to, know what various characters stand for. But beyond that, if they can see, the dots, the points of connection with the other texts and other concepts that we have been discussing in our regular classes also, and apart from that also in these special lectures. So that I think is would be the takeaway from a lecture such as this. I would like to thank Dr. Madhumita Majumdar for this wonderful lecture. I would also like to thank our principal, Dr. Monishankar Rai, for for being with us in our initiatives such as these, such outreach programs and academic outreach programs. I would like to thank Dr. Paromita Haldar, the head of the Department of English, for taking the initiative. I would like to thank our other colleagues of the department. Unfortunately, they have not been able to present in this. They are not present for today's session. But Dr. Prashanta Koshal and Mr. Shorik Mundo, they have been instrumental, in putting everything together. A very special thanks to Mr. Devashish Bormon, head of the Department of Computer Science, for his technical support. Thanks to him, we have been able to live stream this lecture, and we have also been able to record it so our students can avail of it on a later date. So on behalf of both the Department of English and the IQSC of Sir Gurudas Mahavidyalaya. I thank all of you, and a special thank to the students, not just the students of the fifth semester, but also students of the third semester who have participated very enthusiastically and have supported us in this endeavor. Hope this has been very, very enlightening as well as enjoyable for all of you, and hope to meet you again. I mean, obviously our regular classes will continue, but hope to meet all of you again in another such special lecture, and a special again hope on our behalf that Dr. Madhumita Majumdar would grace another such occasion with her presence on a future day. So thanks a lot to everyone.
Thank you so much.
So I say it's goodbye for